Hi, and welcome to episode 3 in this series on the pan crop tool. In this episode I want to explore the practical and maybe not so practical applications of pan crop masking. I say not so practical because pan crop masking essentially is only useful for applying masks to still images. Yes, you can animate masks to follow movement in video events, but it's complex and time-consuming. You can also use masks to create simple graphical elements that you can use in presentations. If you've watched my previous 2 episodes, I use these elements, some animated, to enhance the presentation. In this episode, I'll describe in detail how to create a number of graphical elements with different designs. You could search the web and download graphical elements to use, agreed, but where's the fun and satisfaction in that? In episode 2, I mentioned briefly the ability to apply a video effect to a mask, but didn't go into detail. Well, in this episode I will. I'll be using Vegas Pro 19 in this tutorial, but the procedures are the same for earlier versions. As I stated in episode 2, pan crop masking is not available in Vegas Movie Studio Platinum, so this episode is not applicable. Before proceeding, I think that it would be prudent to revisit the fundamentals of masking. I know I've gone through this before, but the different combinations available make it a little difficult to grasp. So here goes. Firstly, under normal circumstances, when using 2 video events to give the desired result, the event to which the mask is to be applied must be on the track above the other event. So, in this case, video event 1 is the one to be masked. Masks can be either positive or negative. The default mode is positive and causes the area outside the mask to allow the event below the masked event to show through. In this case, the positive mask allows event 2, the yellow event, to show through outside the mask. When a mask is negative, the area inside the mask will allow the event below to show through. The polarity of a mask depends upon how the mask is to be implemented. For instance, to superimpose a coloured graphical element over a video event, as I did in episodes 1 and 2, the video event should be below the coloured event. The mask should be applied to the coloured event, and the mask must be positive. You could, of course, place the coloured event below the video event and mask the video event. However, in this configuration, the mask would need to be negative. If you want to mask out part of your video event in order to apply a video effect to the mask, you need to apply the mask to the video event and make the mask positive. The video effect is then added to the plugin chain and the Apply to FX parameter changed to Yes. If you want to mask out part of your video event in order to apply a video effect to everything outside of the mask should be negative. I'll be dealing with the application of video effects to masks later. For this section, I'm going to use an image captured from episode 2. I'll be creating 2 square masks, one slightly smaller than the other. The smaller one will sit inside the larger one to create a coloured frame. This frame will be superimposed onto the image. The masks will be created on a solid colour media event located on the track above the image. Pan crop masking for the solid colour event is selected as described in episode 2. I'm going to start by creating a square coloured frame. I used this technique in episodes 1 and 2 to highlight certain elements of the user interface. Using the rectangle creation tool, I'll hold Shift down while dragging the mouse to create a square mask. Remember that this will be the primary mask. I now need to create another, smaller square mask. This will be the secondary mask. Now, I talked a bit about mask hierarchy in episode 2. When working with multiple masks to create shapes, such as a coloured frame, it's important to remember which mask is the primary one. For instance, with the video event on the track below the solid colour event, the primary mask, which will be the larger one, must be positive, and the secondary mask must be negative. This will ensure that the frame will be the same colour as the solid colour event, and it will be superimposed onto the video event on the lower track. Conversely, with the video event on the track above the solid colour event, the masks must be created on the video event, and the primary mask must be the larger one and must be negative. The secondary smaller mask must be positive. Again, this will ensure that the frame will be the same colour as the solid colour event, and it will be superimposed onto the video event on the upper track. The 2 masks can then be manipulated to highlight the desired part of the image. Remember that highlighted anchors, that's selected ones, will move in unison, which can help when resizing the masks. You could also combine the 2 masks by selecting Select All from the Workspace context menu. This helps when moving the frame. However, if you then resize the combination, the proportions will be preserved. This is not always desirable. Sometimes it's necessary to maintain the frame's thickness, and this can only be achieved by resizing the masks individually. Again, I'm going to use the image captured from episode 2. I'll be creating a simple graphical element that I can superimpose onto that image. To do this, I'll be drawing a simple arrow shape as a mask on a solid colour media event. Remember that if the video event, in this case an image, is on a track above the solid colour event, the mask must be created on the video event and it must be a negative mask. If the video event is on a track below the solid colour event, the mask must be created on the solid colour event and it must be a positive mask. Conventionally, the video event should be below the solid colour event, so I'll follow this convention. The first thing to do is to enable snapping. I'll then increase the grid spacing to a suitable value. This value will depend upon the size of the proposed graphic. Snapping will ensure that the arrow has consistent dimensions. For accuracy, I'd recommend a maximum value of 64. If it's required that the arrow shouldn't be solid, the mask can be copied and reduced to fit inside the original mask. When reducing the size, make sure that you hold the Shift key down while doing that. This ensures that the mask is reduced uniformly. Also, as the smaller mask is the secondary one, make sure its mode is negative. Some manipulation of the smaller arrow's dimensions will be required to complete the job and will require snapping to be disabled. The arrow masks can then be combined by the Select All option in the Workspace context menu. The combined mask can then be moved, rotated and/or sized to suit. Remember that if you are resizing the combination, make sure that you hold Shift down while doing so. The mask will then remain proportionally correct. To create a mask that fades in and out, it's necessary to get to grips with the keyframe controller. I've dealt with keyframe animation in several of my tutorials, so I won't go into a great amount of detail here. To demonstrate this, I'll be using a simple square mask on a solid coloured media event. I'll be using the mask opacity parameter in conjunction with the keyframe controller to achieve the fades. The first thing to do is to decide at what point on the video event the mask will start to fade in. Let's say I want to start the fade at 2 seconds. I can double click in the time parameter input, type in 0200 and press enter. This will place the keyframe controller cursor at the 2 seconds position on the mask timeline. You have to ensure that the mask timeline is selected by clicking the space at the side of the mask checkbox. A keyframe can now be added, which will be the start of the fade. As this is the start of the fade, I need to adjust the opacity at this keyframe to 0. Now at this keyframe the opacity is 0, but at the first keyframe at the start of the event the opacity is still 100%. I need to move the cursor back to this keyframe and change the opacity to 0. It will be necessary to reselect the mask to enable the opacity parameter. Another way of doing this is to copy the keyframe I created and paste it onto the keyframe at the start of the event. Now to finish off the fade in. Say I want the fade to last 1 second. I need to move the cursor to the 3 second mark by entering the value 0300 into the controller time parameter. At this point I'll create a keyframe. Make sure that the mask is selected and set the opacity value to 100%. That concludes the fade in. You can check the fade by scrubbing the keyframe controller cursor. I can then go to a suitable point on the timeline where the fade out is to start and create a keyframe. The cursor is moved on 1 second and with the mask selected I can reduce the opacity to 0. The fade in and out is now complete. As mentioned previously, if video effects are to be applied to part or parts of a video event, the mask or masks should be applied to that event and they should normally be positive. Using a still image, I'll apply a square mask to it. As the default polarity for masks is positive, there's no need to change this. I'll now add a video effect to the plugin chain. For demonstration purposes, I'll use the Pixelate plugin. In the pixelate parameters, I'll increase the strength to 0.9. This will cause the area under the mask to pixelate. The area outside the mask will remain black, unless there's an event below. If I switch back to the Pan Crop plugin, I can change the Apply to FX parameter to Yes. This will cause the unmasked area of the image to be revealed unpixelated. Any event on a track below will effectively be muted. To mask out part of the image and apply the effect to everything outside the mask needs to be negative. Note that if a second mask is created on the video event, it will have an effect on the masked area already created, depending upon the polarity of the masks. If the first mask is positive and the second is also positive, the area under the second mask will be pixelated. Moving the second mask over the first will have no effect on the first mask. If the second mask is negative, moving this over the first mask will negate its effect. If the first mask is negative and the second is positive, moving this over the first mask will cause a pixelation of the previously unpixelated first mask. If both masks are negative, the result will be similar to that when they were both positive, except that both masks will be unpixelated. If a scene is static, in other words not panned or zoomed, it's possible to create static masks around certain parts of the frame. Video effects can then be applied to the mask or masks. For instance, if part of the scene needs colour grading, you can mask off that part, then apply a colour grading effect to it. This image is of the famous sycamore tree at Sycamore Gap on Hadrian's Wall. It was shot against an angry sky, so the tree itself is a little dark. I want to use the brightness and contrast plugin to make the tree, and only the tree, a little lighter. To do this, I need to create a mask around the tree using the Anchor Creation tool. Now that's completed, I'll zoom in to show the sharp angles of the anchors. I can now right-click anywhere in the workspace and select Initialize Tangents, All. This will work whether the mask is unselected, partially selected, or fully selected. I explained these three mask states in episode 2. You can now see how the sharp angles of the anchors have been smoothed out. I can now apply the brightness and contrast effect to the plugin chain. This has a handy automatic contrast feature, so I'll select this and click the Calculate Brightness and Contrast button. I'll now go back to the Pan Crop tab and select Apply to FX equals Yes. Now, as you can see, there's a slight halo around the tree. This is because it's not possible to mask around every branch and leaf on the tree, but we can do something about that. I can set the mask feather type to In and adjust the strength slider slightly so that the halo disappears. In this section, I thought I'd describe how I created the animated frames that I used in episodes 1 and 2. These were achieved by creating two square masks of different sizes. They were then combined to make a square frame which was made to change shape and position by using keyframe animation. On the timeline, I have a screen capture of the VP19 user interface on track 2 and a red colour media event on track 1. I used red, but of course you can use any colour you choose, although it has to contrast suitably with the colours of whatever image you have on track 2. I'll start by creating a square mask. I'll then create a smaller square mask. This will be the secondary mask, so needs to be negative. Remember the hierarchy of masks? I'll then move and resize the first mask, which is the primary mask, so that it frames the part of the screen that I want to highlight. I can then move and resize the secondary mask so that it forms the inner edge of the frame. The degree of resizing will depend upon how thick you want the frame to be. Now, I have to move the keyframe controller cursor to a position on the timeline where I want the frame to start fading in. At this point, I'll select the primary mask. Using the opacity parameter, I'll reduce it to 0.1. Don't take it to 0, or the mask background, in other words the image, will be swamped by the colour event. This will create the keyframe. Now I'll go to the start of the timeline. I have to ensure that only the primary mask is selected, and then I can reduce the opacity to 0.1. As an alternative to this, I can copy the keyframe I created using the right-click, then copy function, then move to the first keyframe and right-click, then paste. I then need to decide on a suitable fade-in period. I'll use a 1 second fade, so I need to move the cursor to 1 second beyond the keyframe I created. At this point, with the primary mask still selected, I'll restore the opacity to 100%. This will create another keyframe, which will be the end of the fade in. I now need to decide how long this frame will stay in this position. Let's say 3 seconds. I need to move the cursor a further 3 seconds and add a keyframe. this will be the start of the animation. The animation will probably be about 1 second in length. This is arbitrary, but let's stay with 1 second. I'll move the cursor a further 1 second. At this point, I want the frame to occupy its new position and shape. By fully selecting the masks, one at a time, they can be moved and resized to fit the new occupancy. In this scenario, it's not advisable to combine the masks in order to resize and reposition them. Granted, it would be a lot easier than moving them individually, but as I mentioned earlier, resizing combined masks resizes them proportionally. If you do this, you'll find that the frame thickness will vary, and that's not desirable. When moving and resizing the individual masks, make sure you don't lose track of which is the primary one. Remember that, in this situation, the primary mask must always be the one that forms the outside of the frame, in other words, the larger one. When the two masks are in their new position and have been resized, a keyframe will have been created. The cursor is moved again a further 3 seconds, say, and a keyframe is added. If further movement and resizing is required, simply repeat the steps. I can now play the animation to see the result. You can see from this demonstration that there's nothing really difficult about creating and animating simple graphical elements using masks and keyframe animation. All you need is an understanding of how masks can be manipulated and a basic understanding of keyframe animation. The tricky part is coming up with the ideas. Right, this episode is getting a bit too long. There's more I want to deal with, so I've decided to finish it here and continue in what will now be episode 3.2. My apologies for that, but it's taken more time than I thought. I hope episode 3.1 has whetted your appetite enough to persuade you to join me for episode 3.2. Until then, bye for now.